So we're going to alternate questions in the room and then questions online, but I actually wanted to get us started with a conversation that you and I were having over lunch that I thought folks might find interesting, which is whether we see any kind of methodological pushback against using things like poetry, against depicting data using a kind of visual method. Are these methods accepted in the broader scientific space? How are you negotiating folks who say like, well, you've written a poem, but I want the numbers. What does that kind of look like? And as a qualitative and arts-based researcher, I know some of this tension, but I wondered if you can speak to how your methods are received.
Very, very poorly in a straightforward way to answer that. But I think the dynamics around publishing my work kind of changed the way it's received now, because before I had my PhD work where I did a lot of body mapping and some of the listening guide, there it was still people were like, you're going in the field and you're like drawing and using crayons and you're just like engaging in a drawing and painting activity. How is this scientific? How is this rigorous? But then when they see what we have managed to do and when they see the impact of that put next to the numbers, not numbers from my research, because I very furiously do not give numbers. It's my favorite thing to do. Yeah, the more people ask for numbers and the more people talk about some of these things, it's now helps because some of the work is published. And I was also very clear about having my work published in like the, A-list journals like the PLOS, the BMC, things like that. I also I always send my work to the Lancet just to get rejected. There's a very good feeling about like, you have had your chance. But it's something to say that the postdoctoral work is kind of looked forward to because the doctoral work has done very well and it has been received well. Also, I mean, not from all kinds of groups, but then when they see you presenting, there are more people around the world who see that arts-based research is doing well for sensitive area work like obstetric violence and other forms of violence. So yeah, so it's slowly, I think, gathering crowd, not of audiences who are listening to the work, but also of people who are reaching out and wanting to know more about this to do similar work in their area, not just obstetric violence.
And Leah, what was the motivation of including a kind of visual display of findings in your project?
Yeah, I think, again, speaking to experts, which in our case are the participants living with HIV, we noticed that they would actually participate a lot in research, do a lot of interviews at different places, but they never received the findings, or they couldn't find them, or they didn't understand them. So we were kind of hearing from them that they would actually find it more accessible if there was some sort of visual piece that either they could send via email or WhatsApp, they could have a poster in their actual community to view. So I think that was where that stemmed from, similarly to make it more accessible and understand that, if we don't publish this kind of stuff, if we don't put this out here in this sort of way, it doesn't really get valued. So, yeah.
And B, does Shauna have like a report back mechanism, a way of sharing your important findings with your participants?
Yeah, so we do have a positive limits advisory board that meets several times a year, and they give input on kind of the research goals and where we're headed, and hear what we are doing as well. And then there's also a community advisory board that's also organization scientific.
Any questions in the room to one or all of our panelists? Any questions on Zoom? We'll sit in awkward silence for 30 seconds. And you love pushing back and not giving numbers. I love awkward silence. I wonder if I can have each of you speak to the value of lived and living experience in your work. You've positioned the experts in your study as folks for whom this is their life. And I think that's something we're going to hear across the projects that we heard tonight. How do we quantify? How do we include? How do we ensure that folks for whom these are their experiences are reflected in the work we do, and that isn't just kind of anecdotal, but actually core to the projects?
Oh, am I starting? Okay.
If you want to.
Yeah. I think community-based research opens up space for people to be involved right from the start. It was there in my work in India, but I feel like I didn't quite intentionally include people from the point of what questions to be, should be asked and what the research aim should be. But I know that my work was very much from these stories that I'll just like randomly, awkwardly ask people in trains and buses and, on the way to things. But I see how systematically that has been done in Canada now that I'm doing this work here in the respect study, where even the wording of the questions, the languages that we are sending those out in, and at every step we have people, looking through the findings, looking through the way we are doing the analysis. And I am lucky to do a kind of work where the arts kind of speak to people a lot. And often, even when I'm sending manuscripts, they might say that methodologically, it's okay, you're doing something, you have explained it, it's for the academics, but the poems is what is speaking to us. And I also try to keep the language as much as possible. Like in these poems, this is the first time I'm also dealing with English language data. It's usually different Indian languages for me. So I translate and I do that in English, but this time, because it's in English already, I'm not fixing grammatical errors. I'm not changing spelling mistakes and those kind of things. And even the language I'm using in my, say, manuscript or in dissemination presentations, I pick up a lot of keywords on what people have said. And I try to use that language as much as possible in all kind of different phases. So yeah, so that's my, yeah.
I think something that Shauna really does a good job with is through our staff members, who are all people who are really involved in the community. And the questionnaires are really long. I've read through them. And so the community experts who come in, like, it's really important that that trust and rapport is built. And the Shauna staff just really do a good job. A lot of their time is spent not even doing the interviews, but helping participants in other ways when they come in. So I think that's one way that, building trust within the community is central to the work.
I think I'll add on to those. I agree with all of that. But for me as a researcher, I think I talk a lot about empathy, and having empathy and how that relates to relating to your participants. And not to say empathy in a patronizing way, but no one's going to have the exact same lived experience from anyone. Even the people living with HIV, they have all different experiences. But everyone has that capacity to be empathetic towards another's experience. So I think having that degree of listening empathetically is really important when doing research. During my master's, I worked with youth who were ages 16 to 19, and I was only 21 at the time. So I had a lot of empathy and understanding for that. And now I'm kind of on the opposite of that age spectrum and working with people a lot older than I. But I have a grandfather who I was really close to growing up, so I kind of relate to that aspect of it. So I think, of course, working towards understanding their lived experience, but understanding as a researcher, you have one too, and you can relate to that to some degree.
I love that as a kind of guiding principle for what we do. We can approach what we're up to with empathy. I think that'll serve us well. Thank you. Questions in the room? Travis?
Can I ask two?
Of course.
I have one question for you specifically, and sorry, question for all. So I just I don't know if you can speak to this about the slides, but I just wanted to hear a little bit more about how you handle the founders in your study, because you have like one main variable of interest, which was eviction, right? And then a bunch of different outcomes. And I was thinking like, oh, the relationships between these variables are so complex. Like, how do you arrive at a set of variables that you feel like need to be controlled? Like, did you do some kind of graphic tag, or did you?
Yeah, so I would say it was like a combination of drawing out some rough DAGs that quickly got very complicated, as well as just doing a really good look in the literature to see what other people are controlling for. We also looked at bivariate associations between the potential confounders, but we didn't use that as like the only reason we would include them. I would say it was mostly based on kind of what else was going on and what theoretically would make sense. And I have another paper, the one that had the other title, that's looking more at the different like social and structural factors that are associated with eviction. So kind of looking at it the other way around.
Oh, I see. Right.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and so then that probably gave you some ideas.
Yeah, so while we were doing the confounder work, we were like, oh, this would make sense to also look at kind of like a more explanatory variable of eviction risk, I guess.
Cool, thanks. Nerdy epidemiology moment.
We love a nerdy epidemiology moment.
One of my students is here, so now what expect the class. I guess I think for all three, I can like see really like very clear like policy direction from each of these studies, and I'd just love to hear from each of you, like, you know, if you had the power to actually move the dial on one policy mechanism, in Canada, what do you see? And I know you're still in the early stages of collecting data, but maybe you could forecast, you know, like what would you want to tell our political leaders to really move on those things?
Sure. I think from not just analyzing and presenting these poems from those almost 3,000 narratives, the most positive experiences that I was hearing about, the most respectful experiences of care that I was hearing about was mostly in midwifery care. And I know for a fact midwifery care, and I know for a fact that it's still not the like, you know, that option is not available or accessible to most people. So I think that would be one direction I would try to nudge for policy making, to make midwifery and midwifery care more accessible.
I feel like we talk a lot about like building more affordable housing, but I think what's forgotten sometimes is preserving the housing that we already have. And perhaps people don't want to move out of the housing, they may want to stay where they are. So I think investing also in improving and upkeeping the housing that we have, and policies that like keep people living where they are really important.
I think the biggest thing for me is I'm really interested in sexual well-being as opposed to sexual health. And right now in BC, there's no sexual well-being policy in long-term care or assisted living. So there's policies around anti-bullying, anti-racism, discrimination, but there's nothing around sexual well-being, but there's everything around sexual health and care. So what that might look like is, you know, these people are living in these homes, but they don't have access to condoms, yet the STIMI rates are going up. So things like that, sexual well-being policy, I think would be really helpful. We're hearing from care staff too that they're having moments where they might walk in on a resident having sexual intercourse. It makes them really uncomfortable for whatever reason, because they also don't have a policy to lean back on and understand how to respond in that moment. So something around that would be really important as well, I think, for the care staff as well as the resident.
Great question, Travis. Any questions on the Zoom room?
We sure do. We have a compliment.
We love a
We have
compliment.
question. We have a compliment from Camila, who says, "Thank you for all of the sharing. It's always wonderful learning from you." And we have a question from Vika. Hi, Vika. Thank you for your question. It's for B. And it says, "Have you looked at from where and to where people moved after eviction?"
That's really interesting you asked that, because the final part of my thesis that we're just kind of pulling together right now is going to be using GIS to look at kind of what my results would look like in mapping format. And I think what we've decided on is we're going to be geocoding the places where people are reporting living after an eviction. So I hope to have a better answer to that question later on.
Can you tell us
What's
what GIS is?
Oh yeah,
Mhm.
geoinformational systems or
What-
software.
What does that mean?
It's like it's a bunch of online mapping tools, so that you can put your data into more of a visual format. It's really cool. I'm sure the geographer also.
Final questions in the room? Esther.
I have one for there.
So I know your topic is research is going to discuss both long-term care and assisted living. I'm just wondering if you're going to approach those two differently. I'm not very well versed in what they mean, but I know there's kind of a difference between both of this kind of facilities. So is there going to be like a different approach for each of them, or is it going to be just the same?
So we are looking specifically at people 50 plus, 50 years old and over. So long-term care tends to lean to older people. The stay for long-term care is usually only a couple months because by the end of that, often people do pass away. Assisted living, you can be in assisted living at 20, but there does tend to be a lot of older people because of certain disease trajectories or what have you, disabilities, and as people age, they might have lack of support, so they end up in assisted living. So there is a difference there between the demographics. For the most part, though, assisted living does have older people. Long-term care is exclusively older people. So we are specifically looking at the demographic of 50 plus. And so approaching that, we're just ensuring that we are only reaching people that age in these places.
We have time for one more if there's another question in the room or on Zoom. So maybe I'll just ask folks if something comes to mind that you haven't had an opportunity to share yet. There wasn't time in the slides, it didn't come up in the Q&A, but a kind of final thing you want to say of the finding, policy implication, the methodological consideration, any final words that you want to share? And if not, that's okay too.
I think something interesting that I didn't really touch on in the presentation, and I don't really have much data on this with the cohort, is that much of the eviction that we're seeing in BC is no fault eviction. So that's not when people aren't paying their rent. There's different ways that landlords can evict people if they want to live in the unit or they want to renovate it. And that actually makes up 85% of the evictions here. So we don't collect the data. I'm not sure what that means for the Shauna cohort eviction, but that's definitely something at play in the background here.
Very interesting. Final words, Leader.
I haven't lost this time. I'll just do a shameless plug because we're
Love it.
still recruiting. I'm on Twitter, @kʷikୱəlla. My email, I'm sure, is somewhere on Twitter under the advertising for this event. But if you know anyone within those stakeholder groups, please reach out. We're really looking forward to speaking to community organization leaders. So maybe people in this room belong to certain organizations, and we'd love to talk to you.
We love a plug.
Yeah.
And then final word.
I think it's just about like planting that curiosity about what people's embodied experiences are. And if you do find people who have had birthing experiences, I think it's important to look beyond the rosiness of it and the fact that the child was born and there are anniversaries of that, and shift your focus from there to the person who gave birth and what their experience is, because often like there is data that suggests almost everybody experiences obstetric violence no matter where you are. And it's very difficult to go to the depth of that experience to address that in some way. It's just trying to listen in and
That brings us to the end of our symposium this afternoon. I want to thank everyone in the room and on Zoom for joining us.